open up to 2 Samuel 13. We've been away from 2 Samuel here for a couple of weeks. We didn't have a Sunday evening service when we had our baptismal. Last Sunday, we had Brother Mike Maynard was here, and he spoke. He and I were talking after the service. We were standing back here, and he asked what I was preaching. And I said, well, on Sunday morning, we're in Acts, and Sunday evening, we're in 2 Samuel. He said, 2 Samuel, that's good. There's good preaching there. I said, yeah, but about halfway, it's all bad news. He said, yeah, it is, because once you hit chapter 11, it just really gets bad. And we're going to see that here this evening. David's reign peaked in 2 Samuel chapter 10, when the war against the Ammonites was fought. The siege of Rabbah begins. During the siege of Rabbah, when David should have been away at war, he tarried in Jerusalem, you remember. He tarried in Jerusalem, walked out in the middle of the afternoon and saw a woman bathing herself. He sent for her. He took her to himself, committed adultery with the wife of one of his most loyal warriors. To cover up for it, David has Uriah, her husband, murdered, takes Bathsheba unto himself, and he attempts to cover his sin. And he gets away with it for approximately 1 year, we think, between chapter 11 and chapter 12. The baby is born, but Nathan, the prophet, comes to David and calls him out in his sin. He tells him a story. David gets angry. And Nathan looks at him and says, you're actually the bad guy in the story. You've done what I'm talking about. David immediately breaks and confesses his sin. He receives forgiveness, but the consequences of his sin will haunt him to his grave. He receives forgiveness. That's important for us to note. He confesses, he receives forgiveness, he keeps the kingdom, but the consequences of his sin are catastrophic. First, he loses the child conceived in adultery who had been born. He gets sick and dies. And in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10, we read, this is Nathan speaking. He says, now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. The turmoil that David brought to the family of Uriah would be reaped exponentially within his own family. And we're going to see that start to happen here this evening. We're going to see the turmoil, the chaos that began with his sin in chapter 11 is going to begin coming to fruition in his family as well. And we start off in verse 1 with a very complicated family. It says, and it came to pass after this, that means that some time has passed between the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, and it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now, I often will give you the dates that are given by Usher. Usher was a conservative commentator of years gone by, ancient history actually, and he dates Absalom as 21, Amnon as 23, and Tamar as 15. And he's probably, you say, well, how can he be absolutely sure? Well, truth be told, he might not be absolutely sure, but he's close. He's close because we can figure out how old David was at particular given times and figure out his children. And so think of it, these are young adults, and Tamar would be a teenager. And this family is complicated. Now, I've put David's chart for you up several times, and I will again in just a moment. But God's plan for marriage was given by Jesus in Matthew 9:4. It says, and he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Well, that takes an awful lot off the table that's on the table today in 2023 that shouldn't be. Male and female. You say, what about the other 95 genders? Exactly. Okay? Made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain, which is an old way of saying two, shall be one flesh. God's intent for marriage, one man plus one woman for the duration of one of their lives. Okay? That's God's plan. But David is a king, and David lives in a culture and in a time when most kings had harems, multiple wives. They had lots of wives. His son would far surpass him. You remember Solomon. Solomon had many more wives than David did, but David had many wives. As a means of solidifying alliances and trade agreements, if I want to get a better deal on the wheat that I get from this particular kingdom, well, if I marry the king's daughter, then I get a better deal. So, I'll marry the king's daughter. That's how it was looked at. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but not much. Okay? They married for any particular reason. And because of that, David's family tree is far more complicated than it should be. So I'll show you his family tree here. Once again, David at the top, all the light pink are his wives, and he's got lots. And this is not including his concubines, because their names are usually not listed for us. And so the portion of David's family tree that we're going to be looking at tonight is in the green box down here in the left corner. Okay? We're going to be dealing with Amnon, Absalom, and Tamar. So get that kind of in your mind. You'll note here, if you look at the tree, Absalom was David's son by Maacah, who was the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. So, you see here, Absalom, Maacah, this was one of those marriages that was done for an alliance. We need to have good relations with this country or this kingdom. So David married Maacah, and he had Absalom, and then he had Amnon by another wife, by Ahinoam, who was a Jezreelitess. So you'll note that Maacah, the mother of Absalom, is also the mother of Tamar. So Tamar and Absalom are full siblings. They have the same mother and the same father. When you talk about Amnon, Amnon is a half-sibling to Absalom and Tamar. There's a relation through David, but not through the mothers. And Amnon, we read here in verse 1, loved Tamar. The son of David loved her, is what it says. Verse 2, and Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin. And Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her, rather than do the right thing. Okay, the right thing would have been for him to confess his illicit desires as the sin that they were. But Amnon became fixated on that which was forbidden. Now, you say, how terrible for someone to become fixated on that which is forbidden. If we're honest, we would have to say we do the same thing with that which is forbidden. Leviticus 18:11 expressly forbids this kind of relationship, even with a half-sister. If you read in Leviticus 18:11, it says that you are not to go to the daughter of your father. You'd say that's a weird way of saying sister. Well, the reason why is because there were multiple mothers in many of these situations. Perhaps Amnon looked around him. He looked at the pagan culture all around him, and maybe he thought, well, other people do it. Other people marry their half-sister. Can you think, here's a little Jeopardy trivia for you. Can you think of some other fairly famous person in Scripture who was married to his half-sister? Abraham. Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, and so perhaps Amnon looked back and he thought, well, Abraham, he was a good guy. Abraham's a good man. But there's something in mankind that draws us towards that which we should not have. It's seen in small children. When you tell a toddler no, whatever you said no about becomes their all-consuming passion in life. They had walked past that plug 1,000 times, but when you said no, now they absolutely must put a fork in it, right? Because why? Because it's ingrained in us. And Amnon, he knows, I can't have her. I can't have her, but that's who I want. Amnon knew that his father would never allow such a relationship. Rather, he pined after Tamar until, according to verse 2, he made himself physically ill. He was so enamored with his sister that he made himself ill. But in verse 3, the first 5 words here of this verse carry tremendous significance. But Amnon had a friend. We could go off here and talk about how important our friendships are and how much they can change us. Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimei, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very subtle man. So if Amnon is David's son and Jonadab is David's nephew, that makes them more than just friends, they're also cousins. There's a family relation here between Jonadab and Amnon. This is one of many passages that we could go to show that the relationships that we maintain matter greatly. This isn't something that expired with the Old Testament or the New Testament. It makes a big difference. Psalm 1:1 says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." Why does it matter who I walk with, stand with, and sit with? Well, because who we are around is who we will become. That's why we develop accents. If we live in a particular part of the country or a different part of the world, you develop an accent because what you hear becomes what you do. Who we hang around is who we are. Somebody said it this way. They said, "Show me your friends, and I'll show you your future." There's a lot of truth to that. Proverbs 13:20 says, "He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed." This principle carries over into the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15:33. "Be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners." Was there ever a time when you were a child when your parents came to you and said, "I don't want you hanging out with so-and-so"? And you said, "Why?" And they said, "Because they're a bad influence." I only see them an hour a week. That's about all it takes, isn't it? That influence rubs off, especially, it seems. Have you ever noticed that bad influences rub off much quicker than good influences? Have you ever noticed that in your own life? I noticed that in mine. It's easy. If you have children, you look at your children, why is it that they can't pick up my good traits? Have you ever asked that question? You said, there's some things I do well, but they don't pick up on that. Rather, they pick up on my idiosyncrasies or something that I just do kind of weird. That's not what we want, but that's the way it is. Why do my kids pick up my foibles and my weird things that I do? Well, because they hang out with me an awful lot, and it rubs off. A true friend to Amnon would have spoken the truth. Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." What does it mean, faithful are the wounds of a friend? Well, it means that a friend will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. In this case, Jonadab, had he been a true friend to Amnon, he'd have walked in and he might have grabbed him by the collar, slapped him across the face, and said, "Man, you're out of line. What is wrong with you? She's your sister, for crying out loud." He'd have called his friend out on his lust and his disgusting path that he was heading down, but he didn't. Rather, he was working. Jonadab was a very subtle man. Now, we're going to start drawing some connections that I had never even noticed before in the times that I've read through this. Jonadab is playing the long game right here. He's a very subtle man. The word subtle means cunning or shrewd. This same word, hakim, is translated in Proverbs many times as wise. Wise is the good side of this attribute. Subtle, cunning, deceitful, sneaky would be the other side of it. Jonadab is a very subtle man, and he's working towards a goal. And we'll read about it. We won't get to it this week, but next week, Lord willing. Jonadab is working behind. He's working both ends against the middle. Verse 4. And he said unto him, Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? Wilt thou not tell me? Amnon said unto him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. He doesn't go and say, well, she's my sister too. Again, sin does weird things to your mind. We're seeing that. This is far from the conversation that should have been had. Jonadab should have told Amnon he was wrong. His desires are unacceptable and he needs to get right, but he doesn't. Instead, he concocts a plan to assist Amnon to do the unthinkable. Verse 5. Jonadab said unto him, Lay thee down on thy bed, and make thyself sick. And when thy father cometh to see thee, say unto him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it and eat at her hand. Now in this culture, it was very normal for the virgin daughters of a king to kind of be sequestered. They were kept in seclusion. They were not permitted to be alone with a man, with one exception. They were allowed to be alone with blood relatives, because obviously it was assumed that everything would be fine in that case. Tamar, again, Usher puts her at 15 years old, had been kept in seclusion up until this point. She had been around Amnon. The way he got to see her would have been through the family. They would have met at family activities, dinners and whatnot that they would have had in this day, feasts. Jonadab tells Amnon to use his family relationship with Tamar to get David, his father, to allow her to nurse him back to health. And so he sets the plan in motion in verse 6. So Amnon lay down and made himself sick. And when the king was come to see him, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight. I was reading this afternoon in a commentary on this very verse right here, and they said that perhaps cakes were viewed as medicinal. And I don't agree with any of the rest of this story, but I do kind of agree that cakes do help when you're feeling sick, don't they? That's all I'm going to take from, just by way of application there. Ice cream was not in the original Hebrew here. He says, and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. Then David, seeing no problem with it, David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house and dress him meat. Everything happens exactly as Jonadab had predicted. David doesn't suspect Amnon of impure motives. His son is sick. He requests his half-sister to help him out. It's nothing to be alarmed about. So David, again, I believe, innocently tells Tamar, hey, go help Amnon out. He's sick. He asked if you'd come help. Verse 8, so Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. And he was laid down, and she took flour and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight, and did bake the cakes. Again, everything's perfectly normal. We would have no reason to assume anything was wrong. Verse 9, and she took a pan and poured them out before him. But he refused to eat. There's the first weird thing here. That's not normal. You asked me to come over and make you this food, now you won't eat it? But he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have out all men from me. And they went out every man from him. This is strange, but again, probably not the 4-alarm fire that's going off in our mind right now. Tamar, it would have been weird, but maybe Amnon has some sort of condition. Maybe he's worried that in his sickness he'll embarrass himself. We don't know. But then in verse 10, all doubt is removed of his intention. And Amnon said unto Tamar, Bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. When she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her, and said unto her, Come, lie with me, my sister. The sentence that just came out of Amnon's mouth should have stopped him cold in his tracks. what he just said, "Come lie with me, my sister." But the problem is that his eyes are fixed upon the object of his lustful desire, and everything else, reason, common decency, common sense, is cast aside. We sing the song, and I try to bring out this point as often as I can when we sing it. The chorus of "Turn your eyes upon Jesus" says, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." The opposite of this is also true. If we fixate, if we focus on the things of this world, if we focus on the object of our desire and our lust, if we focus on that temptation, then everything else fades away. If you'd have walked up to Amnon 2 years prior, and you just walked up to him on the street and you said, "There's going to be an issue with you and Tamar," he'd have said, "You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind." That had never happened. But in the moment, as he allowed himself to go down that path, as he allowed himself to fixate and focus on the object of his lustful desire, he forgot about everything else. So fixated on his sin that he's determined to commit that all else fades from view. I would say that given the tension of the situation that we're in right now, Tamar gives a very masterful response, starting in verse 12. It says, "She answered him, 'Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not this follow.'" That's putting it mildly. That's the understatement of the year here. No such thing ought to be done in Israel. In other words, she knows that this is forbidden by God. What he's attempting is wrong. She knows it. Again, they're the children of the king. The children of the king would have been educated in the laws of Jehovah. Now, there would be some people in Israel where they might be able to claim ignorance, but certainly not the children of King David. She says, "Do not this folly." Folly to us, it has the idea of silly. In this case, the word is villainy or vile crime, senseless disgrace. She is using incredibly forceful language to try to wake him up. She goes on in verse 13. We'll read all of the verse and then we'll break it down. It says, "And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee." Her second response, as we put verse 12 and verse 13 together, this is what she's saying. As she's pulling away from Amnon, she says these words. She says, where will I go with my shame here? Whither shall I cause my shame to go? Even though she's not a willing participant, Tamar knows that the stigma, the shame of what he's trying to do will cling to her for the rest of her life. Don't do this. Stop. She goes on. She says, "As for thee," she appeals to him on the basis of decency. "Don't do this to me." She appeals to him on the basis of himself. "And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel." It's not just her reputation. What will people think of you when word gets out that you've done this to me? I'm your sister. The last reason that she gives for him to stop, she says, "Now therefore, I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee." We've made the case already that Tamar knows that such a relationship is forbidden by the law of Moses in Leviticus. But maybe she thinks her father will bend the rules. I don't think that's what she's doing here. I think very likely Tamar is trying to buy time, and she's trying to get out of this situation. She's trying to break off this contact. Look, Amnon, you know you shouldn't do this. Let's ask Dad. Let's ask our father. And surely he'll let you have me with her full knowledge. Of course, he's not going to do that. But if we can just break this off, if I can get away from this situation. Verse 14. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but, being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. Common decency, common sense, and thoughts of long-term consequences all fly from the mind of Amnon, and blinded by lust, he rapes his sister. And there's an instant change. An instant change. Look at verse 15. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. Wait a second. What just happened here? If you look back at verse 1, we read that he loved her. But now he hates her exceedingly. It's not love in verse 1. It's not love at all. It's lust. Now, Hollywood and pop culture would have you believe that it's a short walk from lust to love. They would say, those two are practically the same. They would even say they're the same. Well, that feeling that you have, that's love. In reality, it's a short walk from lust to hatred. No, not from lust to love. Those are miles apart. But lust and hatred are neighbors. And that's what has happened. He indulges, he fulfills his lust, and instantly hatred comes. Having defiled his half-sister against her will, against what he knew to be right, Amnon is overwhelmed in a second. It doesn't take long. It doesn't say that, after some days or after some weeks. He commits the act, and immediately he's overwhelmed with guilt, with disgust, with shame. The object of his lustful desire became an epic monument to his failure on every front. And he hated her with a passion. He went from lust to hatred. Proverbs 20 verse 17 says, Bread of deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth shall be filled with gravel. What's that mean? Well, the idea of what we want and pine after when we get it, if it's not what God would have for us, it's not going to be what we truly want. Proverbs 14:12 says, There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. There's an old song, maybe you've heard it before. I'm not going to sing it for you, but let me show you the words. It says, Sin will take you farther than you want to go, slowly but wholly taking control. Sin will leave you longer than you want to stay, and sin will cost you far more than you want to pay. It's a fact. Amnon, she tried to stop him. She tried to tell him that beforehand. She said, don't do it. He said, no, gotta have it. Went for it. Got it. And instantly it turned sour. Instantly he realizes just how wrong he was. Verse 16. He has told her in verse 15, the end of the verse, he says, Arise, be gone. She said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other which thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. Again, these are children of the king. They know the law. Amnon, Tamar, they know the law. Exodus 22:16 says, And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuse to give her unto him, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. She is requiring of her brother that he do the right thing according to the law of Moses. You've done this. Now, don't send me away. That makes a bad thing worse, she claims. in sending her away, in not hearkening to the law, it would be assumed that Tamar had seduced him and would bring further shame on an innocent young woman. Verse 17, then he called his servant that ministered unto him and said, put now this woman out from me and bolt the door after her. Is it any significance that the one he was pining for just a few verses ago, he won't even say her name in verse 17? The object of his greatest desire is now the object of his greatest disgust. And it leads to immediate fallout. Immediate fallout comes to David's household. Verse 18, and she had a garment of divers colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparel. Then his servant brought her out and bolted the door after her. A robe of many colors was expensive. Dye was very expensive, and so if you had a robe with lots of different colors on it, it meant that it had gone through, it was just more expensive to produce. And so people who wore a coat of many colors were either special or they were part of a special group. Can you think of someone else, say in Genesis 37, who had a coat of many colors? Joseph. What did his coat of many colors mean? Was it just kind of fancy and stylish? No, it meant something to his brothers. His brothers said, this means he's Dad's favorite. So the fact that Tamar wears this robe, it's actually explained for us here. All of the king's daughters who were virgins wore these robes. And it was a way that they were kind of a special group, a special class. Tamar is escorted out of Amnon's quarters, and the door is slammed behind her and bolted. Verse 19, and Tamar put ashes on her head, rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head and went out crying. The ripping of one's garment meant they're no longer a part of that class. When you tear your coat of many colors, that means something has happened to remove you from that class. The ashes, the dust on the head. What's with that? Well, culturally, it's a way of showing deep, deep grief. And so she walks out of Amnon's area. She's walking the corridors of the palace grounds in a torn robe with ashes on her head, and she's weeping. Verse 20. Who does she meet but Absalom? And Absalom, her brother, said unto her, hath Amnon, thy brother, been with thee? Interesting that he knew right off the bat, isn't it? There's something's wrong here. I'll give you a hint. His name is Jonadab. He's what's wrong right here. He's working both ends against the middle. We'll look at it next week and you'll see exactly what I mean. If you read ahead, you'll see. Jonadab's working. When Absalom walks out and he sees Tamar, he doesn't immediately run up. Did somebody rob you? What's wrong? What's happened? He walks up to his sister and he says, it was Amnon, wasn't it? Like he knows or something. Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He's thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. I would make the case that Absalom, in this time, he sees opportunity in this tragedy. Here's why. Amnon is David's eldest son. Remember, 23. Absalom is David's second eldest son, 21. And so Absalom now has served up to him on a silver platter the perfect reason to remove the one obstacle that stands between him and the throne of his father. And he's got it set up perfectly. Tamar's rape provides the perfect pretext for a power move by Absalom. You'd say, that's dirty. He shouldn't do that. That's only the first in a long list of things that Absalom shouldn't do that he jumps into with both feet. Absalom's not a young man who is led by the Lord. He's not a young man who cares anything about about the way of the Lord as his father does. David is a man after God's own heart. Absalom is a man who follows his own heart. We see where that leads. But what does David do when he finds out? Well, the answer might surprise you. Read ahead and you'll see. We will stop for sake of time here this evening. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this. And we're stopping right in the middle, I know, but does it matter who your friends are? Yeah, but that's only for like teenagers, because they get peer pressure, right? So that matters with children. I've got 7, 8, and 9. My kids, they need to worry about who their friends are, but I don't, right? No, I need to worry about it too. I should mind my relationships. It matters. James 1 verse 14 shows us exactly where we are. It says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death." Does this ring any bells? Like from chapter 11, where we watch David go down this same path? It's the same path, different set of characters. Same path. He looked, he saw, he wanted, he sent, he took, and then he ends up committing murder. And we're going to see the end of this for Amnon is death as well, his own. Sin always looks enticing on the outset, but the consequences are shattering. Again, the consequences of this sin, Amnon and Tamar. Tamar's life is destroyed. Absalom and Amnon, the tension, the fight that's going on there. And all of this is happening as a greater consequence of David's sin in chapter 11. It's compounding. But sin does that. I would make the case for all of us. When you pray, and you pray, Jesus taught us to pray, deliver us from evil. As you pray for the Lord to keep you from temptation, ask God, Lord, help me to keep the long-term consequences before my eyes. Help me to realize that this sin doesn't stop here. The sin causes a mess right here, but it continues on, and it always does. And it's not something just for the children of kings. It's not something just for the Old Testament. It's something that applies to you and to me. We need to keep the reality before our eyes, that our sin will have drastic consequences for us and also for others. Any thoughts that you have tonight? Questions? Comments that you have? I said there's a lot of bad news. There is. We'll see what happens. It's going to progress. Next week, remember, what was Amnon's friend's name? His cousin, his name is Jonadab. Remember that, because Jonadab is going to have a lot going on next week. We're going to talk about how Jonadab was working, because when David starts asking questions, guess who starts answering? Jonadab. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot going on here. Let's bow for a word of prayer here this evening. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we have the opportunity to gather and to enjoy each other's fellowship, to sing, to pray, and to look into your word. Lord, as tonight we've looked at, Lord, kind of a distasteful story. Lord, as we leave it, we leave with a sick feeling. But Lord, I pray that sick feeling would be something that we can have towards our sin, not just Amnon's. Lord, that we would realize that our sin has drastic and devastating consequences. Help us to keep that in mind. Pray that you keep it ever before our eyes. I pray, Lord, that you'd be with each and every one who's here. Be with those who can't be here for one reason or the other. Pray you keep them safe, give health, give blessing where they are. Pray that you'd be with us until the next appointed time. In Jesus' name.